Hello and welcome to Get Your Evenings and Weekends Back, Release the Progressive Delivery Way. Today's webinar is sponsored by Split and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for what promises to be both a fun and valuably informative event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in that questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, visual, or slide advancement problems, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A. And we'll provide some further technical assistance. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to point out a ton of resources from Split, starting with links to book a demo or to try Split for free, then PDFs for progressive delivery reference card, continuous delivery in the wild, and a feature flag best practice document. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of an event like this is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. So we do have one more gift card opportunity for you, and that's a $50 Amazon gift card for the best question. So at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions that came, very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get straight to the heart of our session today. I'm delighted to bring on our guest speaker, Dave Carro. He's a senior progressive delivery advocate for Split. Dave, welcome to the.
Thank you very much. As luck would have it with the Gremlins, your audio just started getting a little crunchy for me, but hopefully you can hear me clearly. All good?
Yep, I can hear you very well.
All right, take it away.
Yeah, take it away.
Awesome. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody. So the title is Get Your Evenings and Weekends Back, Releasing the Progressive Delivery Way. And if you read the sort of the landing page where you signed up for this, I'm committed to sort of making good on the promises that were there. You'll come away from this having a much better idea of how this is possible and how people are already doing it. This is not a bleeding edge conference talk. This is not sort of a conceptual gee, wow, wouldn't this be neat if this was possible? This is something that lots of teams are doing already. So with that, let's jump right in. So first is a question for you. Does this remind you of release nights? You know, that's a pile of, that's 40 pizza boxes with what's probably cold pizza at this point and some Diet Coke. A lot of us, if you've been around for a while, release nights typically were something we spent a lot of time on. We did it at night, we did it on weekends because we knew we were going to disrupt our normal user population, whether that be with sort of a bumpy transition or whether that be with an intentional maintenance interval, where you're taking the system offline. And I don't miss those. That is not the way I would want to live. And there's really one primary reason why that kind of release night happens still, or did happen in the past, and it was Big Bang releases. So the idea of the Big Bang releases, we'd store up a lot of changes, and we test them really hard, and we sort of try to have a run sheet for what we're going to do when we take them live. But the nature of a Big Bang release is that it's a huge package of work, and you just can't foresee all possibilities with that. And things are going to go wrong. And, in this picture, which is out of this CD in the Wild book, you notice the two people that are kind of inspecting the work coming down the line have exclamation points next to their brain. It's too much to kind of take all in. And so there have been lots of practices about disciplined QA and all this sort of stuff. But the reality is that it's a lot of stuff all at once, and it's really, really hard to do that without having something kind of break, right? The solution is smaller releases done much more often. And you'll see this assembly line here. There's lots of small little boxes passing along, and a smaller box is easier to inspect, and there's less to do each time you put one of those boxes into production. And if you put one into production and something does go wrong, you have a pretty good idea of what it was that caused the problem because you've only made a few small changes, right? That's really the essence of that's the change we need to accomplish, but how do you do that, right? And you might be saying, wait, what? Did you just say do this more often, like you're going to release more often? And yes, more often, but not this, right? Not more pizza boxes, not more late nights, right? So that's not where we're going. Progressive delivery is actually a different way to roll out changes without the late nights and the cold pizza. And that's really hopefully why you're here, right? The promise of getting your evenings and weekends back. Could IT be a day job where I show up, I do my stuff, and we work a regular day, and everybody's happy and everything, and we're getting a lot done, and we don't have to stay up late or order out for dinner or tell our family we're not coming home, right? So I'd like to introduce the progressive delivery model, right? First, we have to do something called decoupling deploy from release. And our goal here is that deploying should be a non-event. We want to be able to push changes to our infrastructure whenever we want and not have it affect users. And that's really the key, which is that I need to be able to decouple the deployment of code from the release to the users, and we'll see how that's done. Second, I want to be able to release to a subset of my users. Again, we don't want a big bang, right? We don't want to give it to everybody all at once and cross our fingers and see how it's going to go, right? We want to give it to a subset of users, and we want to do that when we're ready to do that, right? And then the last step is we want to observe those users that we've released it to before we expand to the next group of users. And what's funny is that some of this just sounds sort of intuitively obvious, right? Like, well, we're going to limit the blast radius, and we're going to slowly deploy to some users before we go to more. And well, clearly, why would you go to more unless you've already figured out that it's going okay, right? But you'd be surprised at how people who just sort of adopted some of these principles don't have a really solid way to do that last step, right? And we'll cover that in more detail later. So what's cool about this is that because we did decouple deploy from release, and because we had an ability to release to a subset of users in a sort of a switch, when we observe that things are going well, it's very easy for us to expand the number of users without a new deployment. And likewise, if something goes wrong, it's very easy for us to contract or to, basically to revert without doing a rollback. And these two things are what makes this a day job and what makes this. When I first did this slide, the subtitle for the third box there was, skip the war room. And I may be dating myself, but I can remember many times of having a separate room where we all would go during a release, and we all had all of our screens up. And of course, this is pre-COVID. Now we do this on Slack or Zoom, right? But everybody's looking at their consoles, and they're looking at the logs, and they're looking at the database, and you have this all hands on deck. The problem with making every release an all hands on deck thing, not only is you're losing your nights and weekends, but you're losing your velocity, right? If every time you release, you have to drop what you're doing and spend hours making sure it doesn't blow up, then you can't be working on the next thing, right? And so these concepts all kind of overlap. So for now, I just want to invite you to kind of relax, soak this in. Teams of very different sizes and cultures and environments and maturity levels are already doing this. And we provided materials for you to download that provide some sort of recipes for this. This first one, which you'll find in the handouts, is a progressive delivery patterns and anti-patterns. And this is kind of introduces the concept and then compares some different ways of decoupling deploy from release. You may have heard of blue-green deployments or Canary releasing. People using containers to kind of roll stuff out. This kind of compares those different ways of doing things and the pros and cons of each. And then at the end, it gives you literally a checklist for how you would pull this off. Now, I had to write this document in sort of a vendor neutral way. So the checklist is sort of a generic checklist for what you would want to accomplish. But if you can imagine you're on a webinar sponsored by Split, we help you do that checklist out of the box, right? It makes it straightforward. The second document you'll find there is called Continuous Delivery in the Wild. And Continuous Delivery in the Wild is a result of a study where Pete Hodgson, who's a consultant, spoke with about a dozen teams, very different environments. And the thing they all had in common was they figured out how to push changes at least once a day. And for many of you, the idea of doing a release once a day may sound, crazy. Some of you may be lucky and you're already there, or you're doing it every week or every whatever. But, so that book nets it out. Like, what are the practices? What are the really common practices they had that let them pull that off? And super good resource. It's an ebook. It's a pretty easy read. And then the last one is this Feature Flag Best Practices ebook. This is another one that was kind of co-done with O'Reilly by Split. And this has a bunch of practices in it. But for those of you that one of your questions is, well, what about if there's data involved? What if I have a database change? How do we do that in this environment? Chapter 6 in there provides some really good examples of how you would do that. So let's jump into the details, right? Let's actually walk through the 3 stages, right? The first one is the foundation, decoupling deploy from release, right? We want to be able to, how do we make that possible in our environment, right? What does it take? And first, let's look at why and where we would do the decoupling. This diagram is out of CD in the wild, continuous delivery in the wild, and it basically talks about continuous integration and continuous delivery. And I want to caution you, if you're in an environment where you're like, oh, well, we aren't doing CI/CD yet, don't let this feel irrelevant to you. This is really the same idea. This example is the best one to use because if you want to do true continuous integration and continuous delivery and flow changes all the way to production on a regular basis, you have to follow this approach. If you're not doing CI/CD, you still get benefits from following this approach, and you'll see why. So where we would introduce decoupling from deployment is right there at the implementation stage. And the reason why is that under continuous integration, what you want to be doing is you want to be, what's different about this is that developers commit their changes to the main branch of code at least once a day. Now, they might be working on something that takes 2 weeks to do. So how could you possibly commit 2 weeks worth of work on day one? You're not even a fifth of the way there. Why would you put that in the code that might go all the way to production? Well, it's because it lets you quickly detect if you have a conflict with another developer, and a problem that's found early is much easier to fix. Again, we're trying to make everything less dramatic, right? So you don't want, let's say you're doing the Big Bang world and you're scheduling for a June 30th release, and come June 15th, you figure out that there's 2 teams whose code doesn't get along with each other, and now there's like a mad fire drill, and they're trying to get it all fixed in 15 days, and they might or they might not, right? What continuous integration does is these people are committing every time, and since you're doing that, you need an ability for that code to be off. So this is one of those fundamental things. This is kind of why these practices exist, is that if you're doing trunk-based development, which is really just another name for continuous integration, that kind of points out how this really works. It's got to be all in one trunk. You have to be able to have code ship off or latent, and we'll see what that looks like in the demo. So now let's look at how we decouple. So hopefully you get the idea that we want to be able to have code that's in our deployment that actually doesn't get executed, right, until we're ready. So the way we do that is with something called a feature flag. And a feature flag is really just a call to a subsystem that says, hey, I need to know what to do next in this next block of code. And in this case, we're calling Split and we're saying, I need to get the treatment, and here's the user context. Here's what I know about the user. And here's the thing I'm curious about. Should I show them the related posts feature or not? And I'm passing some attributes about the user as well so that I could do some clever stuff, like if they're a bronze customer versus a gold customer, do something different, right? And the key to this is get evaluated on the fly at execution in production for every user, every session. So this isn't a config file, right? This is something that's actually live in your code. And let's just walk through it really quick. So if the answer to that question to the subsystem is on, then show the related posts. If you get some other answer back, don't. And in practice, there would be sort of 3 options here, including kind of a safe default, but I'm keeping it simple for now. And I want to show you that for those of you who who are in the development realm, there's a great presentation by a colleague of mine that shows an even smarter way to do this, which is that one of the questions you have is, well, if I put these if-else statements in my code, then I have to pull them out, and isn't that hard? Isn't that scary? And they pioneered a thing on our front-end team here where they actually use kind of a file system approach where the feature flag lives in something called a toggler, and the legacy code lives in one file, and the new code lives in a new file. And the app doesn't really know any of this is going on. It just asks for my component. You have the ability to toggle these as I described, but then when you're done, you literally just pull out legacy, pull out index, and have my feature on be the thing that gets called here. And it's just as simple as deleting two files from the file system, and there's no like editing your code to find the right lines to remove. So I will point to this presentation by my colleague, David Burrows, that explains that if you're kind of have some people that want to kind of go deeper on that, right? Now, so just to step back, the first thing we talked about was how to decouple deploy from release. And the short answer is you want to have a feature flag which can be evaluated in your code live in production. And I missed something I should have mentioned there, which is that one of the goals, if you spend any time learning about sort of these newer ways of deploying software, there's this notion of an immutable object and a pipeline. So you put a package in the pipeline, and it flows through and goes through various stages of testing and deployment. And you don't really want people to be able to tweak this. If you want to make a change, you got to create a new one and go back through the pipeline. And that way you know that you've got a very known object, right? And the key here is that I want to be able to move that through the various stages, and I don't want to have to patch stuff or change things in production, right? I meant to cover that in a bit later. So when we're ready to release to users, that code is already there, right? So the key is that the code that you're going to release is actually already in production. It's just not being seen by anybody yet, right? So now we want to figure out how do we release to the users when it's ready. And for this, I want to do a quick demo so you can kind of see what this looks like. And I'm just going to move my screen over here a little bit so I can have more space. And let me turn on screen share. Here we go. Boom. All right. Scott, you're seeing it okay?
I do. I see it. Looks good.
Excellent. Super. So what you're seeing here on the left, this is just a kind of a demo app. Imagine that each one of these colored squares is actually an end user in your app. This is imagine that is their screen, or that is what they're seeing. And the red means that this new release you're about to release is not being shown, it's off. And the blue means it's on. And right now, the people that have the blue are the development team. So I'm actually selectively exposing the new functionality just to the development team. And then I'm ready to kind of go to the next step. And the reason why we're exposing to the development team is they've been able to validate this actually in production before any user saw anything change at all, right? And then I might say, in fact, let me show you kind of a little bit how the tool works, and you can kind of figure out how to apply this yourself, and then we'll do a rollout, a percentage-based rollout. But imagine if you wanted to be very selective about who's going to see what, right? You could basically say that if the account is of type gold, that I want to serve the on experience, right? And I'll save those changes, and I'm going to get a little diff that tells me what I'm changing, and I'll go ahead and move this widget out of the way. All right, and then literally, as I'm making that change, boom, this happens. This happens in the wild anywhere in the world in less than a second, right? And so if I wanted to add the silver user to, I could do that, and that change would happen right away, okay? But we're going to do a progressive rollout, right? And so I'm going to actually get rid of that targeting rule approach, which is kind of using those attributes we were sharing, right? And get back to where we were when we came in, which is like, we're ready to start doing the rollout. And what we do is we go down here and we say, I want to do a percentage thing, and I want to send the on experience to 20% of my users. And what this is going to do is actually randomly choose those users. And the goal of randomization is to get some of everybody, because if you cherry pick who you're sending it to, you might not find a problem as fast as you'd like to. And I'm going to confirm that. Boom. Okay, so now I've gone out to 20% of my users. And if I wanted to go out to 50% of my users, I could come in and change that again. You get the idea, right? So this is real-time control of what the users get anywhere in the world, web browser, mobile device, server-based thing, whatever, all by being able to decouple deploy from release, and then you're controlling kind of what the return of that function call is. And in the Q&A, we can get into like how fast is this and how reliable is this and all that fun stuff. That's what I wanted to show you was this is the kind of technique of being able to gradually expose it without making any changes to the code. No new deployment, no config file change, none of that stuff, right? Let's jump back into the presentation here. Move my screen back over. Awesome. Now, so some of you, typical question I'll get is, well, what about if there's data involved? And, what about, what if we're migrating an entire service? And the great news is that actually this technique works great for some of those hairiest migrations, the ones where you're stuck in a room all weekend long and you're just praying that by Monday morning you've got it all worked out, because you had to do all sorts of different things and some of them took longer than you thought. Again, quality of life, not a lot of fun, right? So imagine you're moving from one sort of data intensive service or infrastructure to another, and you want to make that move as smooth as possible, and you want to find problems without exposing them to the users if possible, and you want to do this as a day job. You want to do it during the day, right? And so let's first look at how you would have done this without this approach, without progressive blurry, without feature flags. Normally you would, you'd start at the current state, that's step 0 there, and you'd have to shut everything down, right? Because you're going to switch out a lot of stuff, and so you're going into a maintenance interval and you're shutting it down, and you're going to have a come back later message on your website, or your app's going to be unresponsive, or who knows what's going to happen, right? And then you perform the migration, and then when you're done with the migration, you point the front end to the new back end, and hopefully everything's good, right? Now the problem with this approach is that, first of all, there's tons of downtime, right? You have to take it down to make all these changes. If you find a problem, rolling back takes a lot of time, because you've made a lot of changes and you've moved a lot of things around, and God help me if you actually changed the actual database itself instead of pointing to a new database. Life's exciting, right? And so you're probably going to do this at night or over a weekend, and it's very hard to test, because you're basically in a race to get this all done, and you may have some ways to sort of validate it as you go, but you're not testing it with real users, because you're not going to expose it to the real users until you think you're done, right? And so the moment of truth happens when you flip a switch, and then you figure out whether you missed something, right? And then if you do need to roll back, you may have to overwrite transactions, right? So you may lose transactions. So those of us who've been in the business for a while, this is sort of kind of the nature of the beast, and you try to limit these things, but that's what's cool about a different way of approaching it, is that, guess what? These things pretty much all go away if you just use progressive delivery to handle how you do this, right? And I call this sort of a day job migration using feature flags. So again, we're starting at the beginning here, that where it says FF up at the top, that's the end user, and there's a feature flag in the code that's being served to the user, and it's telling them to get their data from the V1 infrastructure. Step 1 is to enable something called dual writes. And I want you to pay attention to the green colored arrow there. So FF, that's the user going through a feature flag. And at the moment, they're reading and writing from V1, but they're writing to V2, sort of redundantly, right? And they're not reading from V2, but they're writing to it, right? And so now you're actually able to prove that the scale works for all those end users to be writing the data to the new infrastructure, that you haven't missed something in the indexing or the caching or the configuration of the memory, whatever, right? Or the scaling of the servers, right? Then in the next step, you do your data migration. So now you basically, if you have to move any data from V1 to V2 and you have to reformat stuff, you have to change anything you're doing that's sort of compute intensive. And this is the fun one that always gets us on the weekend projects, right? Which is that they've estimated it takes so many hours, and then you kick it off and you're like, wow, it's taking a lot longer than we thought. And so imagine this step you could take minutes, days, hours, you don't care. Because right now the users are stable, they're on V1, they don't know anything's happening, it's all good. Meanwhile, you're performing a migration. It doesn't have to be done on a weekend or at night. It could take a week or two for all you care, as long as you've got time for that. But now, when you believe that you're done with the migration, you enable something called a dark read. And take a look at those arrows again. So again, the users are getting everything from V1, and under V2 there, you can see that we're still writing to V2 with real data, but there's something called a dark read, which is that the end user software is attempting to read from the new infrastructure, but it's not actually showing that to the user. You're just doing that to prove, again, that it can scale, and you're looking for errors, right? And you can run this, again, as long as you want. Like, you could run this for an hour, you could run this for a day, you could run this for 3 days, whatever. You could run it through a peak period on your busiest day of the week and then decide it's all good, right? At that point, you actually transition all of the reads and writes to the V2 service. And remember how it says feature flag FF at the top of each of these? The key here is that the only thing you had to change, you didn't actually have to deploy a new version of the code to the users. All you had to do was flip the flag. You got a flag for reads, a flag for writes. And you basically selectively flip these flags as you go. And so as each step along the way, you change, when you're ready to do the next step, you flip the state of the flags, and the users don't have a new version of your code. They don't have to make sure they update it in the App Store. Literally, they're just gonna route their data the way they need to route the data, right? So as a result, by going this route, you don't have any downtime. You didn't need downtime. You didn't need a maintenance interval, right? And rollback doesn't incur data loss because you never gave up the V1 system until you were totally sure you were done, right? So you had sort of that redundant writing of the new data. You never gave up anything. You can migrate when you want to. It's convenient, right? You don't have to do this, again, on some weird weekend or something. And you're testing the migration with actual real data. You've got the actual real users who are doing this. They're kind of really doing a distributed load test for you. Thank you very much. And you're also testing the data migrated the way it should with actual real user data, right? And at all these stages, you can actually gradually ramp that exposure. Like, remember how we did 20% and then we did 50%? So when you're going through those different stages, you don't have to flip one switch to suddenly be hitting the dual writes onto the V2. You could take it to 10% and then to 20%. And frankly, we do this here, and we might get to 10%. We're like, looks great. We get to 20%. We're like, whoa, I'm getting some errors on this cluster over here. And it turns out something's configured a little wonky, and make some adjustments. We roll it back to 10%, make our adjustments. Then we roll it back to 20 after making the adjustments. Looks good. Ramp it to 50, ramp it to 70, whatever. Then we might find some other issue, right? So you can gradually ramp, and the key is you're not hurting users at all in that process. Okay, so that's step one. And step two, we want to deploy a decouple deploy from release. We want to then control the gradual release, and that whether that be just a rollout like we did in the first demo, or whether that be kind of one of these migrations as we did in the second set of slides. Now the third step is kind of important. I'm calling this one the secret, and the reason I'm calling it a secret is that this is the one that people often miss or try to kind of approximate. And if you don't do this right, then it's harder to use this practice and get the benefits, right? So we want to be able to move with confidence. And so we need to be able to observe those users before we expand. And the super important difference here is we need to do our monitoring from the perspective of the flag and the user, not from the perspective of our overall system. I used to be in the load testing business, and it was kind of hilarious where you would tell a customer, yeah, we noticed that you're getting a lot of errors on your product detail page on Black Friday. They're like, oh, no. Our CPU never got past 20%. I'm sure we're fine, right? Well, no, actually, it does matter that people were getting errors, and they were getting errors, right? So one of the cool things about feature flags is you're literally, remember, we're doing this a user at a time, and maybe it's a population of users. It's a group of users. Right? It's a group of users. It's a class of users based on an attribute. But it's basically, we have it all the way down to individual sessions. And if you're observing how it's going and can feed that same data to the same system, then it's very easy to know how you're treating those people that you've given the gradual exposure to. And this is kind of really what Split's secret sauce is, right? So let's just take a second and make sure we understand why this is important, right? Here's a graph, this is an actual graph, and that pink bar there is when the release was exposed to 5% of the users. And basically at that point, it's just like the ambient differences in the graph. There's nothing material, there's not really a step function there. It's fine, right? And then you go to 100%, and this happens. And this is a traditional release, right? You push a release live and all of a sudden your graphs go nutty, like latency's up, throughput's down, right? And this is an actual thing that happened. Frankly, this happened before Split built in the monitoring capabilities that I'm talking about, to be fully transparent, right? So we were marking on the graphs when feature flags were changed, but we weren't actually watching the data for the 5% before we went to the next level, right? And so I add this little comment, which is that overlaying flag changes on traditional graphs is really the way of pain. So if you're just gonna basically say, we changed the flag, and do you see anything? Do you see anything? That's a method that requires a lot of, well, one of the buzzwords would be toil, right? There's a lot of work involved in that, but it requires vigilance. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever heard of cortisol, the more you have to be hyper vigilant, the more cortisol is in your blood, and you kind of get used up or burned out, right? And how do we make this, again, a day job, and one that doesn't leave you, oh, I can do this for 3 years and then I got to retire. Like, few of us have the opportunity to retire after 3 years of hard projects, right? We're on to something else. So you don't want to just overlay flag changes on a regular graph. So that's reason number one. Faint signals, when you're at 5% of the users, it's a faint signal, right? Think about it. That's, if it's only 1/20th of your population, a problem would have to be 20 times bigger than you normally care about for you even to notice it on your graphs, right? So how do we zoom in on the 5% and know more about what's going on with them? We'll come back to that in a sec, but I want to talk about reason number two, why you want to be flag aware when you're doing your monitoring, which is that false signals aren't very helpful either. So let's say you're doing your pet project, you're rolling this thing out, you're making this change, and guess what? Other things are happening at the same time. As much as you would like to sort of control for other things changing, the world keeps spinning around, and so maybe there's some other product change happening at the same time, or maybe there's a marketing campaign. And again, I used to be in the load testing business, and people would have a load test and they'd prove everything's fine, and then somebody would pay millions of dollars to send all their users to a single page on the site, and it would crash because they hadn't tested that. So your marketing campaign may change what's happening in metrics that has nothing to do with what you're gradually pushing live, right? How do you kind of pull that signal out so that you can focus on the real signal? And something like a pandemic happening can change how your users behave. Now that's a slower moving kind of train wreck, but what about nice weather? Depending on what business you're in, it could be that nice weather makes your traffic go up or down, right? So how do I not let those signals throw me off when I'm doing my release? And the answer is that while it's not rocket science, it does rely on a bit of automated data science. And really, frankly, this is just, in a way, a controlled experiment. If you're familiar with like a blind test for like a drug, you take a population and you split them up, and you don't really let them know what's happening, and you sort of watch what happens. And then you decide, did my thing change the outcomes at all, or was it just random noise, right? So imagine there's a bunch of users coming along, and you send 95% of them to the existing code, to the existing experience, and you send 5% of them to the new experience, right? And then what you want to do is you actually want to watch the performance and the behavior. You want to watch like system performance, time, errors, that sort of thing, and behavior. Are users doing what they normally do and or better, or is something going wrong in terms of how the users behave? And so for the existing users, you would plot that behavior and a distribution. And then for the new users, you do that as well. And in this example, you can see that the new users plot doesn't overlap on the old users, so there's a difference, right? And there's enough of a difference that, let's just say that what we're graphing here is response time, and it's markedly higher, right? And so what you want to have happen is you want to automatically get an alert, right? So you'd want to basically, as you're rolling out to 5%, your graphs haven't moved very much, but if you know that for those 5%, their sessions are much longer than normal, or their error counts are much higher than normal, you'd want to get proactively alerted. And book recommendation, if you haven't read it yet, Accelerate. It's a really great book. And one of the key points they make in there is proactive monitoring way better than poking around and trying to figure out how it's going, right? And so having the ability to automatically watch key metrics you care about and have them kind of come find you when something goes wrong is important. And in the context of feature flags, what we're talking about, remember, if you're going out to 5% of your users and something starts going wrong, just like any release, you're kind of looking for a needle in a haystack. Where is this? What's causing this? What code is this? Is the source of this? When you're watching from the flag's perspective and the user's perspective, it's literally like the needle calling out from the haystack. Hey, I'm rolled out to 5%, and people who go through me are much slower. It's bad. I'm causing it. It's my problem. My bad. It's got the athlete raising their hand. Yep, I did a foul, right? So that's what we want to get to, right? That is what flag-aware monitoring is about. So let's just kind of wrap up and summarize what we've talked about here, right? So first of all, our goal is how can we change how we release to make it a day job? And the way we do that is, first of all, we figure out how to make deploy not the thing. We want to decouple deploy from release. We want to let the developers deploy whenever they want. It's not really whenever they want it, but you figure it out for your environment. You want them to be able to deploy as a non-event so that deploying has no effect on users. And then you want to selectively expose users to the new stuff when you're ready, and you want to do it a little bit at a time. And you want the ability to very clearly watch how it's going, both at the sort of system level and at the user level. Like is the performance of the system for that user worse or better? And is the user doing something dramatically bad? Like, are they all unsubscribing? Are they submitting tickets? Whatever. Like, you want to know before you either ratchet it up or ratchet it back, right? Now, here is the good news. So again, I pointed out at the beginning, this is not like a conference talk or a bleeding edge, conceptual theoretical idea, right? So you might be asking, well, come on, is there proof that this works? So I want to show you this. So this is actually a chart drawn from actual split customers. And the fun fact is this is now getting to be, 2 or 3 years old, right? So this is not something that's just now happening. People have been doing this for a little while now. If you look at this graph, so kind of the most important color is that mid-grade pink, the number 3 there. It's called kill. The kill is if you wanted to instantly revert a flag back to the default behavior and like just make it happen right now, and I don't want to worry about which things to change in the targeting rules. I just want to make sure that it's off for everybody right now. That's a kill, right? And then these updates, the dark blue, is when you're making changes sort of to the dials. How much am I exposing it? Who am I exposing it to? And if you look, the vast majority of this stuff is being done during working hours. Those numbers on the bottom are hours of the day in military time, normalized to the people who are making the changes, right? They're all over the world, but teams in Europe, we use the European time, teams in the US, you get it, right? So if you look, the vast majority of the changes, and just not quite all, but darn near all of those kills are happening 9 to 5. Right? And so this is hard data, and you can actually see this if you go to that blog that's in the bottom there, on a mission to kill release nights. This is actual data from actual customers, right? So now you know, and I do invite you, if you haven't already, to download these and or contact us. We really love helping teams make this happen. We're lucky that every once in a while teams will join our all hands Zoom sessions, customers of ours. And I can still remember one customer, Speedway Motors. They're an online sort of hot rod equipment shop. And person after person from their team, whether they were dev or QA or project managers, they were like practically almost to the point of being in tears about how it's changed their life. Because they went from, what's funny is they were saying, we really have gotten rid of the ceremony. I was like, well, ceremonies are usually kind of a good thing, right? And what they meant was they got rid of the all hands on deck thing, and they moved to a very kind of boring, way more frequent releases, way less often things going wrong, and way easier to try things out without risk. And it literally changed their life. They're like stoked about it. So we enjoy those stories, and our mission is to make that really easy to do, so you don't have to build the stuff from scratch. You probably have heard of people that have built their own feature flagging systems. You may be using one now. The key, though, is that putting all these pieces together and having a UI that anybody can use, and having the alerting be something that's just automatic and it's not a one-off hack, it's got to the point where you can just subscribe to this stuff instead of having to build it yourself. So go ahead and download these different documents. I mentioned that one on the right, feature flag best practices. That has chapter 6 talks about how to do data-related changes and some different patterns like expand and contract and the dark reads and all that kind of stuff, right? So that is where I want to stop. And if we could go into the Q&A, let's see what we've got for questions now, Scott. And then I've got some optional slides we can throw in there depending on what comes up.
Okay, super. Yeah, Dave, great stuff. Nice demo, and I love that goal of taking the drama and pressure out of the release. That's fantastic. Paul from the audience also said your pizza box imagery brought back some memories.
Yeah,
I assume that's sort of
in my 20s. Those were fun memories. Yeah, in my 20s, those were fun memories. It was very exciting to sort of like be on this journey and not know whether we were going to succeed or not, and have this free food appear and watch the managers freak out. Because I had nothing better to do, to be honest with you, so it was great. But, as we kind of go through life, it's not really how you want it. It's not what you want your day to day, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So, first question here. How does this approach differ from blue-green deployments and Canary release with containers?
Right. So when you talk about the idea of progressive delivery, just a smidge of history. So these variations on these practices have been going on really for more than a decade. In some places, maybe 15 years, who knows, right? So if you very early days of Velocity and Etsy talking about 10 deploys a day was like, oh my God, how is that possible, right? Like, and now Amazon's doing it, multiple times per minute. There were a variety of practices, blue-green deployments and canarying with containers and such that were out there. In fact, let me jump to a slide really quick that kind of talks about this. So this is from another talk I did, and there's a blog called Learn the 4 Shades of Progressive Delivery. All of these are progressive delivery. So with blue-green, the idea there, once you're using cloud resources, it's pretty easy to just have a copy of production. And it doesn't have to be up for very long, right? So you're running in your blue and you stand up a green, which is basically a copy of blue, and then you make your changes in green. And when you think you're ready, you just route traffic instead of to blue, you route it to green. And so in doing that, you don't need downtime because you can take as long as you want to craft green to be what it needs to be and then start routing people over. And if you route them over and things go wrong, blue is still there. And so you can switch it right back. So if you look where it says limit the blast radius on this slide, blast radius is really 2 things. One is how many people did I hurt and how long did I hurt them for, right? And in the blue-green deployment fit experience, right, you don't hurt them for very long because it's really easy to switch back. But you probably exposed everybody to that until you figured out it was broken, right? And one of the other goals of this process is to actually be able to move lots of small stuff more often, limit your work in progress, and achieve flow, which is this notion of stuff constantly coming out instead of things getting stuck waiting to get out, right? Blue-green doesn't really help with that because it's still a monolithic release that you're going from one to the other, right? And then learning during the process, you learn the hard way, but you don't. There's no way to kind of like learn gradually. Right? If you move over to Canary, that's the idea of using Docker or whatever Kubernetes, whatever you're using, where you've got 100 servers that are providing your solution, and you'd spawn 2 new servers and put the new code on those new servers, and then again route users to 2% of the users to those 2 servers, right? And watch how it goes. And great for avoiding downtime, just like blue-green. Great for limiting blast radius both in scope and time, right? Because you only were sending 2% of your users there. Right? The challenge is you've got kind of a monolithic release on that container. You've got the whole product, not a little subset of the product. And You do learn a little better in that approach because you're running on two of the servers. You can pay a lot of attention to those two servers and figure out, oh, look at the memory. Oh, look at these errors. And I know this is just the new code and I can try to compare it to the others, right? And there's some automated ways, like the Spinnaker has the way to kind of watch that programmatically and say, hey, do I see CPU going weird, or do I see errors? Do I see something else going on? Generally, Spinnaker is good at the system level metrics and doesn't really know about the business metrics, doesn't know what the user behavior is different on, right? But again, looking at the release as a monolithic thing. That third column, feature flags, that about the time the feature flags became more commonly used, the term progressive delivery was coined by a Red Monk analyst. And the reason why was that feature flags had really made this into the mainstream. The blue-green stuff in the container was kind of done by unicorns and the Etsy's of the world at the beginning, right? And feature flags made this much more granular because now you're doing it at the individual blocks of code instead of an entire release. And so it made it really easy to dribble out small changes all the time, right? And to push code out dark and change it just for the developers and then take it live later, right? Feature flags was great for those first three dots, but there wasn't anything inherent to it that made it easier to learn. And that's when this notion of feature flags and flag-aware monitoring comes in, which is if you actually are able to use the perspective of the thing that's driving the feature flags to do the watching of the individual user's experience, suddenly it's really easy because now you're zoomed in on those 5% or the 10% or whatever. It's really easy to understand. I know that's a long answer to the question, but I was wondering whether we'd get to this, and this is from another talk, and I thought it would be useful here.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we put that link in the Q&A, but it's also right here at the bottom of this slide for everybody. If anybody's interested in that, you can just click directly on that link and follow to that blog post. And while I'm talking about that, I also want to flag that in the Q&A console, Cody had a question about the link that Dave flashed up early in the talk, and so there's the answer to that has the URL for that question. Dave, another question for you here. If we want to get started, what is the first thing we should focus on when moving to this approach?
Yeah, so kind of inherent to a lot of this is works best. You'll notice that one of the goals in this slide is, achieve flow, right? And it works best if you learn how to build things incrementally. So what some people will call incremental feature development, this notion of breaking things into smaller pieces. And if you're used to sort of thinking about a problem monolithically, I'm going to make all these changes and that there's all these interdependent things I got to worry about, and so that's why I'm going to do this big bang. You have to kind of relearn so in that book, Continuous Delivery in the Wild, right, which you guys all have access to right now. Let me build that slide again. In that book, literally the main takeaway is if you do nothing else, figure out how to get to smaller units of work. So if you can have smaller units of work, which are those smaller boxes along the assembly line, then everything else gets much easier, and troubleshooting gets easier, and predictability gets better. And like everything whether you're a manager focusing on things like predictability or you're a technical specialist focused on having to troubleshoot on the fly, when you have smaller packages of work that are going all the way out to production on a regular basis, everything else comes together. So the first thing I would do is learn how to ship your changes in smaller incremental pieces.
Okay. All right, great. Yeah, and just a reminder, these 3 items that are up here on the slide, these aren't clickable links, but they are in your handout section, and they're clickable there. So check those out. Dave, another question: Does this approach work for mobile apps and app stores?
Right, I get that one a lot. So you're saying to yourself, people are like, well, wait, I have to submit to the App Store, and then it goes through a review period, and then it finally gets published, and actually, yes, because remember the model here is your immutable code, right? You've got one deployment that happened, and in that deployment, there's one or more feature flags that you can toggle remotely without changing a deployment, right? And so that's what's beautiful about this. Now, full disclosure, Apple is not really thrilled if you use this to basically hide things from the review process. So if you basically turn off a bunch of stuff and don't tell them about it, and then you go through the review process and then you start turning the stuff on, they'll be like, oh, you can't do that. So you have to figure out how to be in compliance with that. But the key is that we have customers who have mobile apps, and they'll have something, it'll get through to the App Store, and then maybe at scale they'll run into an issue, and so they would then back it off. They also have the ability to make configuration changes. We didn't really have time today to get into the notion of dynamic config, but imagine these feature flags, we looked at like on and off. It's actually possible for the flag to carry an entire configuration block, so that Dave gets a bunch of name value pairs related to how various things are supposed to behave. Could be messages I see on my screen, could be the configuration for the search engine, how many results should it send back, how does the recommendations get weighted. Those things can be dynamic parameters. And so what's cool is you can change those remotely, and it doesn't matter if it's a mobile app or a web app or anything, because that setting is being cached into the app at launch. The ability to make that decision, frankly, the way Split works is we load in what we need to be able to make that decision in memory, so that once that app launches, you can go through a tunnel and you're going to read the settings just for Dave, and the administrator can make changes to that, and I come out the other end of the tunnel and I get a signal again. I'm going to get those changes right away, and now I'm seeing 5 results instead of 3, or whatever, right? So yes, mobile apps work great.
Okay, great. We had a question from Paul about PII data, and whether there's any effect on that as far as, using Split, how PII is secured.
So we take that really seriously. I wish I thought about that URL ahead of time. There's a one-pager security doc, and maybe Emma can dig it up. There's a one-pager. If she looks in the content library, she'll probably find the security one-pager. It basically, Split was architected with this exact issue in mind. So we had a vision early on, which is we wanted to be able to sell to banks, right? What did the criminals say? Why did when asked the question, why do you rob the banks? The answer was, that's where the money is, right? But banks are also very, very careful, very risk averse, and very security oriented, right? So we designed it so that you can use PII, but it never leaves your app. And the way that works is that Split's SDK is sitting in your app. And frankly, any feature flagging solution has an SDK that sits in your app. But what makes the Split approach different is that SDK isn't just a little pass-through to some web lookup. It's literally a rules engine, right? And so it actually has the rules that let you ask within your app, what should I do for Dave? And that's resolved instantaneously out of memory, right? Without a network connection. And the PII never has to leave the app because the decision was made in the app, not. So what's really odd, Scott, is that every other solution in the world, most solutions do that for server-based SDKs, and for client SDKs like mobile phones, web browsers, they all do this differently, which is that they make you send the PII or the PHI, if you're in the health business, up the wire, and they get back the decisions. Mm-hmm. They get back the results of the feature flag evaluations and put that in the SDK, right? Instead of, there's 2 problems with that. One is you're sending the PII outside the app, and they're like, oh no, you got to trust us. Our security's great. And we won't even log it, honest. Like, really? How do you troubleshoot? Like, you don't log it? You do? You don't? What you do, right? So one is that right. Trust issue of like sending it out. That's the big one. And then I'm forgetting what the other point I was going to make, which was that the fact that if you need to go get the answers at the beginning, what happens is you ask all the questions every time. So imagine you're trying to keep track of who sees what feature, and you launch the app and you go get the answer to all the questions at launch. You're now going to think that Dave got all the features because you evaluated all the flags for Dave. But if Dave never navigated to the part of the app where that feature is, you should have never found out whether it needs that feature or not. Like with the just-in-time rules engine, which is what Split does, you don't ask us what to show Dave until you get to that code, right? And so on launch, it doesn't say Dave saw 15 features. On launch, it says nothing, and then as soon as Dave gets exposed to a flag, then Dave saw a flag, and you gave him this version because of that rule, right? And so we call that just-in-time.
Right.
And while it's possible to do that with this sort of other approach that people use where they send out to the net to get the answers, it's inefficient to do that as you step through the code, because then you're making all these network round trips. And so most developers with the other solutions will literally go just wholesale get all the answers at launch. And so
Gotcha.
PI and PHI is super critical, and it's just frankly, it's how our architecture works. And you'll see that we don't generally want to have PI. We don't really want you to use a user ID that's meaningful. Like, rather than send us somebody's email address, we want you to send us a GUID for who they are, or hash it. You can hash their email address, right? Because we don't care. We don't want to have that data. Our system has all sorts of security reviews too, and we have frequent, people that try to hack into it for us. But by design, and this makes our security reviews much faster. So we go to a bank or something, and they're like, "Oh, wow, okay, I never leaves my app. I'm really good at keeping the data in my app, so let's move on."
Gotcha. Yeah, and Emma found that link, the Split Security Primer. So I think she put the response in Paul's question, and I also put it out there as sort of a separate question and answer. So anybody in the audience who wants that link, it's out there for you in two places. Maybe time for one more question. Let's see. Mari is asking, can this methodology replace use of GitHub? Is it a replacement or something that complements it, or how do people use it?
No. Definitely not a replacement for GitHub. So GitHub is just a way to manage your source code. And if you're going to adopt continuous integration and continuous delivery, you need a central repository and the ability for every developer to easily get back into that repository and get code and merge it back. So this is complementary. The flag needs to live in code, and you're probably going to store that code in GitHub. And so, again, this is one way to look at this. This is kind of the last step in the process. Like, remember when I showed, I'll jump way back here. When I showed this picture, right? That release to the user thing at the end there. We're focused primarily on that, right? We need the flag to be put in at the implementation phase so that the developer can test their code out in both states, right? But that release to user step is the last thing. So you've gone, source code was involved early on, and maybe during the deploy to pre-prod or the deploy to prod, that's physically getting pulled from GitHub or an object repository. But we're going to be in there just working the same.
Gotcha. All right, super. Well, Dave, like I said, I think we're up on time. But it's if somebody wants to get started with Split, any recommendations as far as good first steps?
Yeah. So we're kind of unique in that if you go grab a free account with Split for the first 30 days, we give you effectively the enterprise feature set. Like, for the first 30 days, you've got everything we got. And then we don't shut you off. After 30 days, we give you in sort of our free forever tier, which is kind of meant primarily for developers. And it's pretty much all the feature flagging functionality, but not the flag-aware monitoring. And so that if somebody wanted to do a side project where you're using feature flags for dynamic configuration, using them to switch things on and off, all of that is actually in the free tier. What you wouldn't get there, and by the way, API access too. What you wouldn't get there would be things like integrating with your SSO, or like the stuff that enterprises want, right? So the easiest way is to just go ahead and grab an account. Also, ask for a demo. Our salespeople are a little different in that they actually want to know what you're trying to accomplish. And any good salesperson should. I don't really mean to but it's pretty common for people to sort of like, here's what I got, here's how it works. If you're interested, here's how to find me. We actually have this sort of like process we do with people that want to go through a proof of concept, where we figure out what's important to you and what do you need to prove for you all to feel comfortable here. And people give us great reviews on sort of how that process is more centered on them instead of centered on sort of our bottom line. But yeah, so reach out for a demo or grab an account, and don't be shy. We love to help people with this stuff. I think the links are there too, right? And the 2 links in the list.
Yep, there are 2 links in the handout section. There's a book a demo with Split, which is the first link that you'll see, and then there's try Split for free right under that. And those are both URLs. So got a few seconds to grab those. So bookmark them. Dave, thanks a lot for being here. It's been fun and really interesting. I really appreciate your time and all your insights.
You're welcome. It was a blast. Take care, everybody.
All right, and with that, we're going to go on to the final thing of the day, which is the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing, and the winner today is Andrew Yaksik from Massachusetts. So congratulations to Andrew. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Split for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. And that's going to conclude today's event. So have a great rest of your day.